Our next speaker doesn't really need an introduction. Ed Faulkner, he's part of the Ember Core team, the steering committee, and he's kindly given us some of his time to answer any and all questions that we have around Ember Polaris, which I'm super excited to hear about. Now, we've got a bunch of questions, or a few questions previous to today. Marco's going to go through those and kind of conduct the AMA, Ed. But first of all, I guess, do you want to maybe just give us a little overview on what Polaris is before we get cracking on the questions?
So to define Polaris, we just have to talk about what an Ember edition is and why that's a useful concept for us. So a thing to know about Ember and the way Ember does releases is that when we do a major release, a Semver major release, it's supposed to be not a big deal, because the point of major releases is to garbage collect old things that are already been deprecated for a while. And so it's supposed to be that new features can land continuously in minor releases throughout the life cycle of a Semver major version range. And so new features are landing whenever they're done, right? And that leads us to led us to the challenge of saying, when is a good time to, especially if you're landing a whole family of features that work well together, and you're going to land, we don't want to gate letting people use those features or try to coordinate big bang releases where they're not available till some big major point. So we want to land things incrementally, but we also want to have a way to communicate to the community when is a good time that things have landed and they work well together and they've stabilized enough and been documented enough that they're now it's now a good time to look at what is new. So that you don't have to, because not everybody wants or can spend their time following the nitty-gritty of the RFC process, what features are landing in Ember, right? You're focused on your applications. So editions give us a way to communicate when there is a large chunk of work that is now ready enough to focus your attention on, and it's a good time to learn it and adopt it and begin using it in your applications. So an edition really is like it's a nice packaging of features in Ember. The first time we did a named edition was Octane, where we landed all the features that are Ember Octane. Polaris is going to be the next one. That's the code name that I don't even know who picked it, but there's a code name of calling it Polaris. And so, it's not a major, it's not a breaking release. It's really a collection of features that are already landing and landed. It will be called done when those features are all landed to everybody's satisfaction, and we've got documentation and all of the polish is there. That's when we would call an edition done. I would expect it to land, though, right within the current Ember 4X series. It's not going to be breaking changes or anything like that. So that's what an edition is. So what Polaris itself is, it has a couple of really high-level themes. The best reference into what those themes are and how they work would be to go back and watch Yehuda's keynote from EmberConf this year, where he laid those out. But at a high level, a lot of it really is pulling together a bunch of work that has already happened in the community to make a much more integrated development experience in Ember apps, and streamlining getting better interoperability with tools, getting apps that are easier to navigate no matter how big they are, things like that. So really an emphasis on streamlining the programming model and trying to cut out concepts we don't need anymore and make the concepts we have align with JavaScript, the language, and all the things that it offers us in 2022. So that's the quick intro for Polaris, and we could dive into questions now though about it, and I think we'll get more detail on all those things.
I posted the link on the Zoom chat already. We do have some questions, and we collected some questions over the past few weeks. First question that we have is, what feature are you most excited for in Polaris?
I did a bunch of the Polaris idioms, and some other folks working on that with me, who are kind of ranged from very highly experienced Ember dev and to intermediate to advanced Ember dev, have basically said now they miss it already when they go back to apps that aren't using it. And the big things that you're getting and that they miss is the first class templates, which we could dive into that feature, what that means. Integrated with full glint type checking, meaning that you have you're able to use if you choose to use TypeScript, you're able to use TypeScript all the way down through your templates. Like it's fully understood by TypeScript. And so all the little things like jumping to definitions, refactoring, renaming things, getting type errors if you change the arguments to a component and you don't realize you found all the call sites, all of that stuff just works the way you'd expect it to. And it's so nice that it does. And so it's really an integration of a list of features, which is really the hit list of like what is in Polaris. It's Ember making the TypeScript support much more first class. It's the first class component templates, all composed really nice with a few other things that are small but really consequential, like the default helper manager feature that is landed. And basically, let's just plain functions can work as helpers. And once you have first class templates, all of that composes very, very nicely. And so it's just that experience is the feature. It's a collection of features that all work really well together to pull that experience off. So like the legs of the stool are like TypeScript, Glint, first class templates, plain function helpers. All those things together form a nexus of just like authoring an Ember app is now extremely integrated with your tools, integrated with JavaScript, and feels really nice. So that's like, that experience is the key feature that I'm excited for. And I definitely like, it's still like early adopter thing in the sense that a lot of this stuff it's not in the default Ember blueprint yet. Or it's not in the guides yet. So you're totally like not behind if you're not ready to adopt that stuff yet. But a lot of it is already landing in Ember, and the features are there, and you can use them. And I'm excited to. And really, in any app where you've got a team who's excited to adopt the stuff, you should try it out, and because it is really nice. And then once you try it, you don't want to go back to not having it.
Could you maybe go into a bit more detail about what first class template means? I'm not sure everybody's fully aware.
The RFC that defined it as a concept and got it adopted is RFC 779, first class component templates. This is the idea that we create an actual file format that lets you integrate your handlebars and your JavaScript in a way that really makes sense. So the idea here is that you get actual template tags that have a meaning embedded in your JavaScript. The biggest benefit of this is that they share lexical scope. So it's now possible to, for example, just write a function in your component's JavaScript file, and then invoke that function as a helper from your template, and it all just seamlessly works the way you'd want it to. And so there's a whole lot less friction now to doing things like that, where like the friction of making a helper before that is kind of high, because not only is it not just a plain function, so you have to remember use the blueprint or remember how to construct one, but it's also always globally scoped. And so it's kind of a high burden to bother creating one and naming it. And now when you can just access things from JavaScript scope, you get to use all the other tools of JavaScript to manage complexity and manage shared utilities or local scoping of things. And that's what's nice about it. It's definitely a mental shift for folks who are used to Ember as it has been. The RFC is extremely well written. It goes into a lot of detail. Let me find you some examples. This is really more in the motivation section about what it used to be like. Here's an example. Like here's just to give people like a high level sense of what we're talking about. Is the idea that a component like this could just have its template here inside of itself. And so, this of course is opting us into having a syntax that goes beyond JavaScript. So this would have a GJS file extension for Glimmer, or GTS if it's TypeScript. The tooling for this is implemented. In fact, maybe it's even better if I open this up in my editor, where I have we have the syntax highlighting and all looking nice. Landing that on GitHub will be a longer effort, right? That's the tricky side of picking a syntax. But we've just seen that there's a lot of benefit in picking and making a syntax and controlling it, and lots of frameworks do it, and it works. Like the extra bit of effort in having a relatively thin transformation to give you the syntactic space you need ends up being worth it. So In a case like this, a couple things about this. One is that you can still have just template only components, and they still really are HTML first. Because if you don't want to define a JavaScript class, you can just have your component file could contain nothing other than this, and that just still means a template only component. And so it's still very HTML first in the sense that you could just take a blob of HTML, wrap it in a template tag, paste it in, and your template is a valid Ember component now. But then when you want to do more, you can begin using JavaScript scope alongside that template. And things like if you just typed a plain old function in here, you can invoke it as a helper in here. That's nice. If you have other components, you can have local components and invoke them in here, and they work. A big supporting piece of how this works is that, so this RFC is about the syntax that lets you put your templates here and what that means. But it leans on an earlier RFC, which is the strict mode, handlebar strict mode RFC. So this one explains how we're really streamlining the way templates work and resolve things and getting rid of a bunch of old implicit behaviors that made them much more complicated. So traditionally in Ember, there was a bunch of implicit behaviors and global looking up of things and things that could be ambiguous, where when you look at it, you really didn't know what was going on. So for example, like not being able to tell when you see a name being accessed, was this a property on my component? Was this an argument? All that stuff. A lot of that has already, like as of Octane, already got cleaned up a bit. This goes further and actually mean like there's no more global resolution of components that's automatic. And so if you want to invoke a component, you have to get that component into scope. And so it works much more like JavaScript, that if you want to call a function, you have to import the function. If you want to invoke a component, you have to import the component. And this lets us cut out a huge amount of complexity of both the build tooling and the runtime tooling, because now we're able to lean on what JavaScript can give us through the module system. It has trade-offs for sure. A lot of stuff that now that you have those imports there, it's like there's more visually going on in your file, right? You do have to import things, even some of the things from the Ember itself, like the on helper, for example, comes now as something that you import to use. But we think that trade-off is very, very worth it. And that once people try it, they get really used to it and like it a lot better than what's there now. In particular, because all their tooling understands it. Anybody who's new to Ember understands it because it's a standard JavaScript language feature. And your builds are just much easier to, the build tooling can just much easier understand your application, right? We don't have to today to get a typical Ember app building in a way that's optimized and code splittable. You can do it, but Embroider has to do a lot of work for you to do build time resolution of all the things. And with this, the resolution is explicit already. It's laid right out as in a syntax that is intentionally designed for that purpose. So those things come together to do first-class component templates. And that composes really, really well with another thing I mentioned, which is Glint, which is the type checker for handlebars for our templates, because now everything's in one scope. And so even TypeScript can see how things connect. It knows that the component you're invoking in your template, it knows where it came from. It can go find its type. It can tell you if you mistyped an argument. That sort of thing is very powerful.
I guess there's still no plan sort of to like make Ember TypeScript first or so, right? I guess it's still like TypeScript and JavaScript, just like TypeScript in a better way than we have it now.
Exactly. And so there's been a ton of work landing around TypeScript, and mostly because what we've done now and are landed as RFCs and have also landed several things as implementation is committing to first-class type support. So meaning that types ship within Ember as opposed to being maintained along the side, right? And that was a large chunk of effort to get it right, because it's, we take our semantic stability guarantees pretty seriously. We try not to break things in Ember itself, and try to make upgrade paths reasonable. TypeScript itself has differing opinions about how it does semantic versioning of releases, and it doesn't ever really guarantee that that a new TypeScript compiler version will introduce new type errors. So there was a bit of work to do to figure out how do we keep our own stability guarantees while we're providing types. And so there were a couple of really detailed write-ups on that that helped us land it, including, let's see, so the official TypeScript support RFC is 724 by Chris Kreitcho. He's done a huge amount of the work on this TypeScript stuff. This is a roundabout way of answering your question, to say, no, it's not like TypeScript required for sure. We definitely don't want that. It's definitely it's an important choice for teams to make. Teams at a certain scale, I do think it's a good choice to choose TypeScript, but it definitely adds learning and overhead for folks who haven't done it before. So it really can depend on your team, their comfort level, their experience level, and whether it's right for them to adopt TypeScript. So we are not pushing TypeScript. But a nice thing about this first-class TypeScript support is it even helps the JS-only teams, because a lot of tooling, particularly VS Code, will take advantage of the types even when you're editing JavaScript, and it'll give you things like auto completion, automatic documentation in line as you hover over things in your code. If you've ever seen that even in your JavaScript, that's happening because the editor is seeing the types from TypeScript and using them to help you and give you a better experience. So all of that is to the good and helps JavaScript developers just as much as TypeScript developers.
Kind of a different topic now. I think many people saw Yehuda's talk on like this week or last week or so on Starbeam. And obviously the question is, does Starbeam play any role in the future of Ember? Like maybe for Polaris, is it separate for now? Does it replace Glimmer's tracking, whatever?
I think it does, yeah. I don't think it's probably Polaris timeframe. It's really more, well, honestly, in the Polaris timeframe, the thing that would probably be not too unlikely is to land, effectively adapters, so that anything that has, so Starbeam is effectively a way to take our Glimmer's reactivity model, which is a really nice one with tracking, auto tracking and all, is a really nice reactivity model. We think it's one of the strongest things about Ember, and it is just really nice, and scales up very, very well to applications of arbitrary size. And reactivity systems being different is also one of the big barriers to interoperability of different code bases. There's an awful lot of reasons you might care about interoperability. Lots of companies, teams get acquired by new companies, and now they've got an Ember team and a React team, or a Vue team and a Svelte team, or they've got a component library written in one of those, and now they need it into using it in an app with another. And all that interoperability is to different degrees possible when you cross some of those boundaries, and harder for others. And a lot of what's costly about it is differences in opinion about the reactivity model. And so Starbeam is an attempt to extract and formalize what we think is one of the best reactivity models, and make it usable in all of those different environments, including Ember and including other frameworks. And I know they demoed like React and Svelte, and I don't know what else. But the idea there is that it's very much aligned with how Ember and Glimmer already work, because that's where the ideas all came from. So plugging it in so that you can take like existing Ember components that use attract in a system that is using Starbeam as its common baseline for reactivity, that's probably not very difficult, and is a thing we could land pretty quick. The thing that would probably be after Polaris timeframe would be to actually like switch out the actual, Glimmer tracking code base with the Starbeam code base, which is, it takes the learnings from Glimmer and streamlines it and is like the next generation. It's almost like a Glimmer 3 or whatever version you want to consider us on. It's not the full rendering system though. It's not like component rendering. It's just the auto tracking piece of it, which makes it smaller and much easier to work with than to say like dropping in a whole new rendering system again. So I do see that as probably getting folded back in and becoming the standard thing. But my guess is it's post Polaris timeframe, just because Like we have plenty of stuff to land in Polaris, and the benefits, like it's not a big change to the Ember programming model, right? It might be more like eventually you import tracked from Starbeam instead of from Glimmer tracking or something like that. But I think it's very consistent with our existing programming model.
There's been talking about the router for quite some time. It needs to change, needs to modernize. Yeah, the question is, will there be changes to the router? If so, what would those potentially look like? Obviously, like anytime you talk about the router, you have to mention the evergreen question. Do we eventually get router components maybe?
Yes, get rid of controllers, which is the other way to spell that question. Yeah, so so for me personally, you know, when I looked at what are the things that I most want to improve in Ember, like the build tooling was number one, which is why I've worked on Embroider so much. But the second is routing, which is in my priority, comes right behind it as the thing that really needs that similar treatment of a reboot. I do think that the goal is for that to be in scope for Polaris. So we don't want to ship Polaris without those things, we think, without improving a bunch of the stuff that I think many experienced Ember devs know needs improving about the router. I would summarize the list of kind of what needs to happen and what, at least a good way to summarize the state of things is what stuff about is out of date and problematic and gives people pain. And I think if I start listing that, I think a lot of people will probably agree. For example, it's definitely weird that we still have these route templates that aren't really components, but that are close to being components. A pain point that there's like waterfall-based asynchrony in the hierarchical routing. It's a pain point that when the model hook runs is hard to understand and teach. It's a pain point that model-to-model transitions on the same route don't really reset local component state. A whole bunch of that stuff manifests, even if you wouldn't have put it in those words, it manifests in friction for development and things that are harder to teach and harder to learn and concepts that we don't necessarily need anymore. So where I see it going, I think that Jim was right when he mentioned resources as a foundational primitive for Polaris, and that includes the routing. When you think about what a resource gives you, it encapsulates a lot of the lifecycle stuff that traditional routes have to deal with. And so I think it's not a bad way to think about things that if the route's job was to produce a resource, that frees up a lot of, it's a big simplification and frees up a lot of the design space for composability. So what I mean by that is you could now, the same way you could use a resource in a component, you could also choose to use it as part of the routing. And if a resource doesn't depend on things in any other resources, routing can all fetch data in parallel. Things like that give us just a nicer experience that lets us drop concepts, and including the controller concept, right? The controllers, they're still around because of the way they intersect with the current routing design, and a proper redo, like to get rid of them cleanly, we have to redo routing and we have to redo query params and make it not be the kind of legacy system we have today. That's what's keeping them in the framework right now. So by fixing those routing APIs, we can drop controllers as a concept, and effectively make it more so that when you route, a route is going to determine a set of parameters and a component to pass those parameters to, right? And now you don't need this extra concept. The things that are quite painful about both the current route class and the controller is that their lifetime is way too long. And so when you think about examples like we were shown in Jim's talk about resources, what's nice, one of the really nice things about them is entangling lifetimes of things, right? When you associate a resource with a component, it will live on for the lifetime of that component, and their fates are tied together. And that's a nice thing. It means you get really nice automatic state management and teardowns and things like that. And there's a lot of different lifetimes that matter in an application. A route really logically wants to have a lifetime of when you're in that route, right? Like today you have activate and deactivate hooks on a route, but when those are firing, those really should be like creation and destruction of the lifetime of the route. And if you had that, resources on the route would just make sense. Now it would be possible, for example, to, if you wanted to have a route that loads a model that has an active subscription that needs to unsubscribe when you leave, that could just use a subscription resource and it would be tied to the right lifetime, right? As opposed to now when you'd have to like learn these special hooks, learn these special methods that routes have. So just, you get a whole lot by using the existing concepts that you need anyway, because you need a resource concept when you're doing these kind of things in a component. You might as well use that same concept when you're doing things at the route level. Now, a thing we don't want to give up that is good about our routing system is that you can take routing to an extreme where everything about routing is modeled as components. And so like, you know, a parent route would fetch data and render its children, and that's literally going to lead to the next level of routing and the next level of routing. And if the only tree of stuff you have is the components, it is much harder to do really good global parallelization and optimization and things like that. And also just in terms of app organization from a convention standpoint, it's actually quite nice if there is still something that is a hierarchy of routes that is a separate hierarchy from the hierarchy of components, because you know, it's nice to be able to discover what's going to happen before you start rendering, right? Like by the time you're rendering, you end up getting complicated flashes of state or slow waterfalls. And so, you know, different existing systems out there take different approaches to this and have different pitfalls, but we definitely don't want to get to the, like, there is no routing kind of, you know, routing is just a convention on components would be taking it too far. That said, though, you can do everything in React, like using the existing reactivity model of auto tracking and resources built on that. You can really model all of routing as that, so that, you know, conceptually you do have some rootmost component that is what Ember is rendering, that is your application, and in it is a thing that is rendering state off of the router resource, right? And the router resource is its own state machine that's updating stuff. And, you know, one of the ways to think about auto tracking and Ember's reactivity model in general is that you have a data world where there's just your application specific models, logic, objects. It's arbitrary JavaScript. It's plain old JavaScript objects. There's really no, you're not really restricted, and you could use mutation as much as you like, and you could use immutable data as much as you like. You're really not constrained. You're able to just change state in JavaScript, doing normal JavaScript things, and you have total freedom in the data world. And as long as you've annotated your states with tracked, the rendering world will respond to that correctly. And that's what's really nice about auto tracking. Routing can be a bunch of state transitions in the data world. And so, you know, routes, I think there'll still be a concept of route that is an object that has a lifetime scoped to when you're in a route. And I don't think that thing's exactly the same as a component, because we do want it to live in data world and have control over when that gets reflected to the rendering world, because you want control over things like, you want to be able to encode things like loadings and errors and all that sort of stuff elegantly through the composition of resources. And that means like your routing is still a concept. Like a route, I think, will still be a concept that's separate from a component, but you get to skip over all of the route template concept, the controller concept. And to point at like the last important piece of router work that is really the crux of why we haven't even landed, you know, dropping controllers yet. It comes down to query params being a complicated system that grew up and got added features and got very tied to some very specific implementation details. And it's not easy to use, and it's confusing, and it's genuinely a tricky piece of the system, because just, you know, it's a place where purely one-way data flow is not really the right way to model things. You really have a more subtle thing, kind of like input tags also have, where you really have different kinds of data flow depending on initialization of a system from the URL, but then also the URL is both an input and an output, right, is the tricky bit. So you have to model that carefully to not have data cycles in your system, or to not force really painful read validations and things. Like you could model it as entirely one way, so that every change to a query param requires you to transition and rerun routing. But that's also kind of painful. It's not really what you want. You don't like if you're just trying to capture a query string that people are typing, you're not trying to reinitialize all your components every time they type a character, right? Like the URL really is an output sometimes and an input at other times. And that's why the design of them is more subtle. And I think we have good ideas of what to do there, but that's work that hasn't landed yet.
We're kind of running out of time, and I just want to get a few questions covered. So maybe one to sort of close the topic of routing. You mentioned before how sort of lower level primitives and APIs enable experimentation and enable people to use like Polaris concepts like already now, although it hasn't sort of actually be released publicly. Does something like that exist for the routing as well? Like, is it in theory possible sort of for someone who's adventurous sort of to just replace the entire router with their own thing, or would APIs have to be added first to enable that kind of experimentation?
There are things that need to be added in the same way that we did, component managers and helper managers and things like that as a way to establish a very low level API. That's not something normal devs have to learn, but it gives you a way to safely plug in new ways of doing things. By safely meaning like we're committing to supporting it, right? So that you can use it confidently in your application and know that you're going to be okay. And even if the patterns you use turn out not to be the ones that get adopted by Ember, they'll be implemented in an add-on that can keep working with Ember because that add-on is using these stable low-level APIs. We do not have exactly that for routing yet, and I think that really is one of the important next actions to work on. It's a tricky one because I suspect that there's really two strategies you can. So one thing about adopting new routing is I don't think while you could relatively easily make a global switch that says like turn off all the old routing, give me the new routing. As a practical matter, that's not going to help people adopt it in applications today, right? It would only help new apps. Existing apps really want to be able to adopt these features incrementally. You're not going to rewrite 250 routes all at once, right? You're going to want to do it one by one. So the question is then, there's really two paths to supporting incremental adoption. Do you need both the old and new way of implementing a route to work? And so do you implement the new small simplified core of routing and then have it provide, effectively re-implement the old things on top of the new thing as a backward compatibility API? Or do you do the reverse and you basically create a slimmed down set of features that are available that are the new routing, but it all lives, agglomerated with the old routing? And in a perfect world, it's nice to do that first thing. It's nice to do a new small core and do perfect backward compatibility. In practice, the old routing APIs are very timing dependent. People rely on a lot of weird, I won't say weird, but a lot of very specific implementation details of them. That makes it, I think, unlikely that you could swap out the whole implementation without breaking the subtle timings they're relying on. I mean, a big piece of redesigning these APIs is so that the new APIs don't have those subtle timings where you literally can't care about when exactly things are happening. But the existing APIs, people do care and their apps would break. So my expectation is that we would have to have a somewhat effectively a new optional feature that you could set that puts you into new routing mode, but you can't turn it on until you've ported all your routes. And until then, you really have the old router and the new routing features side by side in your application as your upgrade path. That's how I see it going. And so, it makes it hard to, I think it's still worth doing the manager level API thing because when you do flip the switch, we want people to be able to try that world. Like that's the only way we're going to know if the target we're porting to is good. So we do need that. Just in most applications, I think you'll want to be using old and new side by side for an extended period of time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, one question might be relatively short, maybe. We'll see. It's basically about bundle size. So question is, vendor.js without Ember data and welcome page is 133K gzipped with an Ember Fallout 4 app. Still, what's the future with that? Do we get smaller?
I think it's a lot smaller. And the big things that you get to cut. So, the routing that we were just talking about is a good example where there's actually about 3 different layers of abstraction that make up the way routing works today. And a lot of that, there's a lot of impedance mismatches between those layers. And that's just historical cruft that has accumulated as people did the best they could to add features and didn't really have the know-how or ability to go and add them at the deeper layer. And so they put layers on top of each other. So the routing system is much bigger than it needs to be. And I think that if you get to, when we get to the point where you can flip this feature flag that says, all my routes are new style routes, you cut a large chunk of code out. The other thing is that along with that, there's a class of other, that's on the list of things that what uses Ember object, the old object system, the old KVO system with computed and all that. Routes do, right? They extend Ember object. Controllers do, they extend Ember object. Glimmer components do not, but classic Ember components do. So a big goal for Polaris would be that you should be able to have if you start a brand new Ember app that only uses new things, or if you take your existing Ember app and you do the work to drop the old things, you will be able to have a build that doesn't have Ember object. And that implies a long list of other things that are pulled into it, right? There's a lot of all the support for the old computed property system. That adds up kind of a lot, right? All the old support for observers. There's a lot of stuff there that drops once you're not using it. And I expect that even within Ember 4X, this is not like an Ember 5X thing. I think within 4X, if you're not using those features, we don't want you to pay for them, and you should be able to drop them from your build, and we should be able to see that vendor.js get much, much smaller. I mean, it also, I don't think will be in vendor.js. I think it'll be in the Embroider managed side of things, where it's some arbitrary set of bundles that are split according to the default rules, which are pretty good, or whatever rules you want to make for splitting, will have it.
Please talk a bit about Embroider version 2 add-ons. Is Broccoli Black Box Magic going to be deprecated? Are we users going to have an official alternative, or are we on our own through just use vanilla.js?
Yeah, so I do think we'll see Broccoli severely minimized or dropped entirely. I don't know that we'll succeed in doing that in the Polaris timeframe. Even Embroider uses Broccoli heavily as the glue to let us get compatibility with a lot of existing things out there. But it is definitely a big friction point, both for the learnability of the system, the number of people who could contribute to the system, debug the system, and even the way that tools like VS Code or TypeScript can understand the system. It gets in the way of all of those things, and it's just not a very. The problem is that instead of shipping libraries to users, we ship programs that emit libraries to users, and that's very powerful, but it's also extremely hard to analyze and hard to understand from the outside. And so we really want to get into the business of most libraries being libraries, most Ember add-ons, and all Ember apps use Ember add-ons because even the standard blueprint has a bunch of add-ons in it. We want those all to just be normal libraries. And to the extent that they are helping compose special features, build time features, we would like that to be visible. I would like to make it so that, it's just a fact that every Ember app has Babel right now, but you don't have a Babel config.js file, right? It's all sealed away from you, and you need to learn very custom things to deal with it or understand what it's doing. I think that should be visible, not because we want to make you write it, and not because we want it to have hundreds of lines of code in it, but because having even just 2 lines for each of the important things that are really making your app work is incredible. When I say 2 lines, I really mean like import the thing and use the thing. That really helps teach how the system works and make it possible for people to understand, right? Understand, improve it, contribute to it, and customize their own thing when they need it. So that kind of a thing. To get to that world, we really do have to drop the magic of Broccoli, right? I think that add-ons that want to provide dynamic things still have 2 paths to do that. One is that a lot of stuff is narrow enough to express in the macro system that Embroider gives you that lets you just get a little bit of dynamicism in your JavaScript. The other is to give people explicit tools that they're supposed to use. So like if you want people to, if you're an add-on that's going to let people compile Markdown into components, then, you need to give them the function they're supposed to call from their Babel.js config or Webpack config, whichever it is, right? And it really is not a big burden because it really should be just a couple lines. So that's my goal for that stuff. And that's why I would argue it's good to begin taking away the extreme power that add-ons have today to do anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we have to get let go of a bit of power to get some other value over time, right?
I saw one in the chat asking about Ember object, action being on Ember object. Yeah, it is, and I think it would drop along with Ember object. I think a much simpler alternative could cover remaining things that it does. Action does carry a bunch of legacy behaviors that help it interoperate with the whole computed system, which is why it's on Ember object. That was kind of on purpose so that it would go along with Ember object. Switching away from it to something that you may need nothing at all. A thing that I was just chatting with Yehuda about last week is that, in principle, there's no reason that invocation in templates can't provide the right this semantics like method invocation. So if you have a method on your component and that you want to call as a helper from your template, or that you want to pass, basically in JavaScript, if you wanted to pass a callback and you wanted to get the this binding right, you could just use a fat arrow a lot of the time. And that's probably the nicest way to do it. Or you would use, function.bind. And both of those things are things we could express. You could have a bind decorator for when you really want that. But we can also just, if we gave you something equivalent to fat arrow syntax in the templates, the need for an action helper, the binding that it does, one of the main things people still need it for is the management of the this context for the function you're calling, right? And so if we gave you the equivalent of a fat arrow, you wouldn't need any of that, right? You can just use it when you need it. When you need it, you can call your function directly. So yeah. If anybody wants to shout out questions or drop them in the chat, that's also fine. One thing that got asked and not in the pre-questions that I don't think came up yet was somebody asked, how was the feature set for Polaris decided? It really isn't that there's like some smoky back room where this all happens. It's not really decided until all the features land, and the features are all landing through the public RFC process. So, a long list of stuff that has landed are things that I would consider parts of Polaris, but Polaris emerges from that work landing. So default helper manager, the many TypeScript RFCs that Chris Kreitcho has shepherded, the first class component templates, there's new test helpers that landed as an RFC, which helps TypeScript users, but also helps a lot with just one of the weird things about the helpers we have today for rendering is that they take a template and not a component, and those are two things. And the template concept as separate from a component is really just not part of the programming model. So now they'll take a component, and so you can just put that template tag that I showed. You can just pass that after this with this RFC. You can just pass that to the render test helper to render that component, and it all just works. Yeah. So let's see. What's the biggest challenges porting ES6 Octane app to TypeScript and Polaris? Well, if porting to TypeScript is a thing you can always do incrementally. You can always keep JavaScript and TypeScript together. So I would take the TypeScript off the table as a requirement. It's not a requirement for Polaris, right? It's just that TypeScript will be easier under Polaris, and if you were planning to adopt it, but haven't yet, you might just decide to wait till you've got more of the first class stuff landed in Ember. I think if you are already all on Octane primitives, I think that means your component layer is in pretty good shape for Polaris. I do think that you could get that far, but still have a lot of gnarly older code in places like controllers and routes that call lots of hooks about setup controller and manipulate a lot of state on it. That stuff is the kind of stuff that we would try to be able to drop from Polaris as non-idiomatic, not as not supported, but as non-idiomatic. So if you've got a lot of gnarly controller code and setup controller, or controllers with a ton of stuff going on in them, that stuff is not really is probably not going to be idiomatic in Polaris. That doesn't mean it won't work. It should work, and it should interoperate just fine. But if you wanted to get to the point where you could like flip the switch and drop the old routing system, you would have to refactor that. I think that would be some of the longer term work you'd have to plan to get to refactor that kind of stuff out. A lot of that you can already do by refactoring your controllers into components. As someone else said in the chat already, like It's the only thing you have to do from controllers is set up query params. And other than that, you could always delegate work to components, and that's almost always actually cleaner anyway, because the components have the right lifetime. Like they actually get destroyed when you leave the route, and you don't have to worry about that. So to the extent that you can port controller logic to components, that's already good. Like it's already, I would consider it already best practice, just because it's less, there's less foot guns on it, and that puts you in position for Polaris. Oh, style handling's a good question. So the template tag proposal is designed so that there's like, adding new syntax is not a thing to do lightly. As we did it, we did consider that we want to make sure there's room to add new kinds of tags. So a style tag that it could appear inside the component is definitely designed as a thing we left a place for and made sure the syntax would work. And this, like when you think about how it's supposed to map from GJS to JavaScript, there is a story for where you could put other tags. Like style would make the most sense. Also, even potentially other extensions if people wanted, right? If you wanted to have something like a GraphQL query tag that lets you express things in GraphQL syntax right within your components, like that's within the bounds of possibility, that extensions you could do with the syntax. I would see style as being worth doing. I think it's, I don't know that anybody's like signing up right now to make that be part of Polaris. We definitely have enough stuff on our plates. I would like to see a big simplification just of what we already have. A lot of the existing style pipeline stuff in both in classic builds and under Embroider, because Embroider doesn't try to completely wholly replace it to give you compatibility, is still very push based, where we're just kind of gathering up all the styles and glomming them together, as opposed to integrating styles with the graph of the application, right? And under Embroider and under Ember Auto Import 2, you can integrate your CSS with the dependency graph. You can import CSS into, and that creates a dependency between your JavaScript module and saying like, when I run this, CSS must exist, but it doesn't. That's like the minimum just to pull CSS into the graph. It doesn't have opinions about scoping or things like that. That would all be things you could extend on top. It would be nice to have standardization there. I think people have a lot really widely differing opinions and needs around CSS. So I think it's still tricky to pick one true way. And I would like to try to make it easier to give people the tools to do things. That's also one argument for why I think it's important to have transparent configuration. If your build, if you just have a pre-made Babel config and pre-made, say, Webpack config just sitting there when you build a new Ember app, if you want to use Tailwind, or you want to use some future thing that is a newer, cooler Tailwind that hasn't even written yet, or you want to use some kind of version of CSS modules, there's lots of existing content out there that will tell you how to do that, because you'd say, oh, well, I have a Webpack config and I have a Babel config, or if it's not Webpack, it's Vite or whatever else we're going to, be able to plug in under Embroider. By following those existing directions, you get those features, right? And we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. So I think making all of the setup transparent helps us with that stuff. Because I do think styles is an area where there's not one consensus way to do things. Tailwind is a very different experience from Sass or from CSS modules, and lots of people are doing both of those things, and we're not going to just pick one as the Ember standard. Yeah. All right. If nobody drops another question, I will be done. But you should feel free. Or you can just shout criticism and get everything off your chest. There's a Starbeam Discord. I didn't know that. Do we talk to people transitioning to Ember? Yeah, that definitely comes up. I think that onboarding is a topic that smart companies think about a lot, right? And so I think a lot of more of the conversations I have are with folks who are in engineering leadership positions at companies who are not themselves the new recruits, but who are sharing their own new recruits stories about what's good and what's hard and what's easy. I have had the chance to work with newbies too several times recently, and that's always instructive. Yeah, it's important. I just, I don't think it's a great mystery what helps learnability and adoption, right? It's the more you can lean on, like the best way to teach stuff to people is to not make them learn anything at all because it's something they knew already. That's just kind of like cheating. But the web platform and JavaScript both give us so much now that we can lean on more than we could when we started. I mean, certainly so much capability now that we can just lean on things that have become standards or de facto standards where we can use those. There's just much less for us to teach. And then we could really focus on the things that are unique and valuable and special about Ember. Like I think our auto tracking system really shines through, having a community process that helps apps upgrade. All that stuff is great and worth celebrating and worth, it's what keeps us all going is like we have this big family of applications that we're taking care of and we want to see them into the future continue to be valuable. So we could focus on that important stuff and focus less on reinventing things for our ecosystem that we don't have to anymore. It's great that stuff is standard now that we don't need to maintain. I guess I should join the Starbeam Discord. Although usually I just get Yehuda to tell me about it. I have that opportunity. Because he won't talk about, when he wants to talk about something, he'll just talk about it. Doesn't matter what the topic is.
Bit over time. I hope we have covered all or at least most questions. As always, Ed, very informative. Always a pleasure to have you. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Frankfurt, for having us. Thanks, Europe, for joining us. Let's all say see ya. And we'll see you next time in somewhere around December sometime in another city in Europe. So thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Bye-bye.